Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Inspiring Psychologists, Breaking the Mold of Private Practice. I'm Wendy Kendall, your host, a psychologist and private practice coach. Today we're exploring the power of collaboration, working with big companies to create positive change in the workplace. We'll delve into the transformative stories of two exceptional business psychologists, Michelle Minnikin, founder and captain of culture at Work Pirates, and Rebecca Longman, author, career coach, podcaster, and now organizational psychology consultant for Mind Gym. Our conversation today will unpack key themes, including the shifting power dynamics in the workplace and the value of an evolving psychological contract informed by our private practice experiences, and the innovative strategy of positive disruption. We'll also explore the idea of partnering with smaller companies as a way to influence larger corporates' behaviours through their supply chains. If you're a psychologist looking to broaden the reach of your private practice, this episode will inspire you to look at how you can create enduring systemic change within larger organisations. Remember, you can connect with like-minded psychologists and continue this conversation in our Inspiring Psychology Practices Facebook group. And for more resources and information about our guests today, be sure to visit our website at inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com. Now, let's dive into this inspiring discussion. Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Inspiring Psychologists podcast, where we are breaking the mold of private practice. And today we are talking about the power of collaboration, working with big companies to create positive change in the workplace. And I'm going to be talking to two of my colleagues, Michelle Minnikin and Rebecca Longman, who are both business psychologists. And, I'm pretty happy because the business psychologists are back in the house. We've been talking with clinical and counseling psychologists. And as much as I love my clinical and counseling colleagues, I'm feeling like I'm getting in the comfort zone with my occupational colleagues today. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this discussion where we're going to find out more about how business psychologists are shaping the future of private practice. So welcome to the podcast to Michelle Minnikin and Rebecca Longman. Hello there. Hi.
Hi.
It's great to be with you today. And we were talking in the comments on LinkedIn, I think, when we put the notice up for this LinkedIn Live that was coming out, and commenting that, first of all, it's really awesome to be kind of back in the room together, because we've known one another now for about, 5 years, at least 6 years, because Michelle, you're one of the originals, as we call you, from the original Psychology Practice Accelerator program, which feels like a world away now since I first met you at that point. Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, I think you were like Practice Accelerator 2 or something.
I was, because I remember when I first joined, I had my first son, and he's 5.5 now, and because you got him a little TPPA baby growth.
TPPA 1.
Which I still have. He was the first TPPA baby, I think.
Yes, and he was not the last. We've had several since, which is pretty awesome. So I'm also we were kind of excited in the comments as well, because you two are now living within 20 miles of one another, whereas when we first started out, Rebecca, you were on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yes,
beaming to us from the East Coast of America every time.
That's right. Yeah, I was in Connecticut, and I just moved back 6 weeks ago. And Michelle and I have yet to meet because my life's been pretty chaotic since moving back, but it's on the cards.
It's on the list of things to do.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And, next time I'm in the north of England, I'm going to have to buzz up and see the pair of you.
Absolutely.
Right. So we've just got straight into, the whole oh, isn't it nice being with our mates again? But could I ask you for some introductions, please? So, Michelle, starting with you, an intro to who you are and what you're up to.
Who am I? I don't know today.
It's a very existential question.
Like Matthew, I'm going to be Tina Turner.
Yeah, well, I was Kate Bush with this hairstyle. I had a bit of a hair disaster last night. So if you're Matthew, go on. We'll get into it.
Yeah, too much coffee already this morning, clearly. So my name is Michelle Minnikin. I'm an organisational psychologist and coach, and soon to be author, which has been painful and scary, but mostly painful writing. I am the co-founder. I'm the culture captain of a company called Work Pirates, which I run with my partner and my partner. So that's interesting. So we do things like leadership development coaching, touch on some neurodiversity stuff as well. So yes, based in Newcastle.
Yes.
I also have an ADHD diagnosis, which is also lots of fun.
Yeah. Which you also talk about. Very kind of share a lot of stuff, and I think I've learned a lot of things from you about the insights and information that you've shared about that. So fabulous, thank you. Over to Rebecca Longman.
Thank
a little bit of an intro from you, please.
Sure. So I'm Rebecca Longman. I currently work for an organisation called Mind Gym as a consultant, I guess, really, kind of in leadership development, training, sort of a management role in there. And I've actually, it's been a bit of a sort of journey, really, for me, because I have freelanced for them and now I'm kind of on a permanent contract, but I'm always kind of exploring new things, and I'm sort of moving around the business a little bit and doing different things. Moved from the US, moved over here, and I'm always sort of still looking at my private practice stuff as well. So I'm also an organizational psychologist. I am also a coach, but I don't use my coaching skills as much as I would like. And I'm also an author. So I wrote a book called Let's Love to Work, which is about basically giving people the sense that they have ownership over how their careers play out, more so than I think people give themselves credit or realize that they have. I think it's very easy for us to get stuck in the kind of hamster wheel of how work controls us, I guess, and we forget to make those choices. So that's kind of what that book's about. And the thing that sort of holds me back from continuing to do more in that space is just the fact that I have two little boys. They're 3 and 5, and they are a lot of work. And so outside of kind of my day job, I struggle a little bit to fit everything in. So I very much want to do more in that space, and I try and apply a lot of that in the work that I do in my role, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But yeah,
exactly. And what I particularly remember about your can you hear this really awful noise going on? Can you do any? We have Ava in the background working on the sound, so I don't know what's going on. Why our sound is. Try mute and unmute, Ava says.
Was it doing that when I was talking too? It's just you, I think, isn't it?
I could hear it when you were doing that, yeah. Anyone? Have a go at muting and unmuting. I will do that. And I'll do that again. Oh, go on, Rebecca, unmute. I've done it, I think. I don't know what's going on with that noise, but anyway, let's see if we can, I don't know. That's really
Sounds like there's mice.
It does sound like there's mice somewhere. What's happening to our live feed? Has that calmed down now? So sorry. it may be a little bit of feedback from the thing, but we'll carry on. So Rebecca, I remember when you were when you and I were first working together, that I think, Rebecca, it might be some feedback that's coming from your mic. So I will mute you if that's all right. And then there we go. Awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that. So yeah, I remember when we first met that you had been doing consultancy for big companies. And I think at the time you were working as Red Ponder, which I really loved, this kind of play on the words and so on. But and then what I really remember about the development of your private practice, and what I think is a really interesting journey to share with people, has been, and in fact, Michelle, I see reflections of this with your journey as well, where you have both taken several iterations and evolutions in how you've developed your practices. And it's almost like, as you have been challenging companies to create more positive changes, you yourselves have evolved through those positive changes as organizations, as businesses. So Rebecca, I remember, Love to Work was this wonderful kind of grounded analytic project that you undertook, where it was accompanied by podcasting, and then you wrote your book, and then it evolved into connecting with this organization, with Mind Gym, where you were freelancing. And then obviously life has evolved, and at the moment you've moved back into that role, but still with, as you said, these are the threads that are really meaningful. So yeah, I'm just really interested in kind of understanding your perspective on these evolutions. And Michelle as well, I remember that I think when we first started working together, you evolved through some projects. And then I remember one of the big things that happened was working with Sam Conniff, if I get in the name right.
Yep.
Yeah.
I didn't really work with him. I just read his book, but yes.
Right. Yeah, but then there was like a partnership that started to evolve, which was very influential. Mm-hmm. And then through Inspiration North and the podcasting, and then also then into Work Pirates. So it's like these very strong evolutions in positive change and development in your workplaces, whilst you're also challenging other organizations to do that. And I think that's like really fascinating. So, Rebecca, how's your audio doing? Oh, right. It's maybe not working. So, Michelle. Michelle, for you, can you kind of reflect on some of that journey and those evolutions, and whether that was that intentional, or what was driving that, or whatever reflections you have on that?
Yeah, I was like, well, we can go back to when I got my first proper job as a psychologist after doing my master's, and I was working in a independent psychology practice with a chap who ran his own business, and I was like, oh, I'd love to do this when I grow up. But being a young female, bubbly thing, I don't think I would be taken seriously at that point. So I embarked on the career in various companies and did lots of sort of selection development type of stuff. And it wasn't until 2016 when I either got sacked or quit. Still don't really know to this day. And thought, bugger this, for a bunch of bananas, I'm going to do it on my own. Because I was like technically a proper grown up at that point.
Right.
And I fell into that trap, I suppose, of creating what you see around you. So
yes, it's a great way to describe it. Yeah.
And I never fit in at work, but I didn't know why at that point. And so I created this fairly boring psychology practice that didn't really represent me. And I found I really struggled to sort of connect with it, because it was just the same as everybody else, and trying to sort of look all professional and formal. And, as soon as they sort of saw that, they were like, oh yes. And then they met me, and then I'm not, I'm not super formal. Our branding has swearing in it, heaven forbid. And and so I really struggled to sort of connect with that. Then I met James and I read the Be More Pirate books, and something almost clicked, that sort of permission to be more us. So we created the Inspiration North podcast as a very expensive hobby. And we learned so much by meeting and interviewing people every Monday for 148 weeks.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
Just nuts. And then the pandemic happened, and we realized we were just so busy doing things that weren't really bringing any money in. So luckily we got some big projects to sort of see us through, so we didn't starve. But I'd lost that loving feeling, as it were, for the previous company. And I was sitting here, James's desk is next to mine, and I went downstairs to make a cup of tea and came back, and I was like, we need to rebrand. And within 10 minutes, Work Pirates, we were on GoDaddy, and the .com was available, all the socials were available. It wasn't anywhere near protected, looking at the trademark stuff. So we're like, right, this is it. It's obviously waiting around politely for us. So we created the brand, got some awesome people to help with that, and started being more us.
Yeah.
And you and I were both part of the NatWest Entrepreneur Accelerator.
We were. I forgot. Yeah,
yep.
Exactly. We both did that for a stint.
And it was all about grow, scale, scale, scale. And I'd seen a couple of my colleagues on the program grow, and scale, 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 and then collapse and unscale and ungrow. I knew that wasn't me. The worst part of the job that I ever had was having to manage people. So we knew that we didn't want to. So we've got a lovely little collective of people that help us do bits and pieces, and it feels more authentically us, and we can say what we think, and we can be a bit more challenging and a bit more provocative and cheeky. And people either love us or hate us, which is, I suppose, the mark of a decent brand.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so I think, something that I really, that really struck a chord with me there, first of all, was feeling out of place in the workplace. That's hard relate, which is interesting as an organizational psychologist. But I think, when I think back to the first role I had, there was very strong element there of, and it was in keeping with the role, even though it was an internal role, where we were there to challenge the system anyway. So in that role, it didn't feel as though that was particularly a problem. And then the other thing that I really picked up on was where you said, I created the thing that I saw around me, which I think is what we do, because it's almost inevitable. Why, how would we not do that, basically, So having the permission to do things differently is, I think, really giving ourselves the permission to do things differently, which I know is something you resonate with as well. So because I think that's the topic of the book, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. But then this whole thing of I lost the loving feeling about about it. And I think that's such I didn't realize, starting to work with other psychologists in private practice, that there was going to be this element of disillusionment that actually is like the path. It's a little bit of a philosophical element, whereby that thing that is causing the disillusionment is actually the path to, the promised land kind of thing. It's, the path back to exactly. It's back to what's really meaningful to us, because we've got off track somehow. And, with Work Pirates now, I know you talked about this brand being either, you love us or you hate us kind of thing. But it sounds as though that comes from a place of strength. Like, it's not kind of fearful about it.
No, and sometimes we say things and we cringe because we're like, we're expecting a backlash, and we don't get any.
No backlash.
Yeah, no backlash. I think we're probably staying under the radar to a point. But yes, so the strap line, I had to check with Ava just to make sure I was allowed to say this. But we dithered around for ages trying to figure out what Work Pirates was. And I was on a Zoom with some of our collaborators, and I said, it's just like unfucking work, but I can't think of a more polite way of saying it. And they were like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. So, we checked with the marketing company that we work with to see if we can get away with it. We'll just put asterisks, it's fine. But that's exactly what it is. Instead of having to do some kind of, we work with forward-seeking organizations who would like to make work better and people happier. It's just easier. It's shorthand.
Yeah. And something that really strikes me about the tagline of unfucking work is that, and thinking about some of the discussion points I've seen you raise, is that there's a strong element there of being on the side of the workers, which is interesting, because it lends itself to a kind of activism then as well, about there's a reason behind this, there's a mission behind this, so do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
To start with the capitalism and patriarchy, but it is fascinating watching the shift of power. With globalization and people being able to work remotely. So the shift of power from the employers to the employees.
Yes.
Where we have the gift as employees of choice. I could go and work for a company in California if I really wanted to stay up really late or get up really early and never figure out what it is. But we can harness that cross-country collaboration. We don't have to necessarily up our family and move. And the companies that don't realize that they have less power than they thought they had, obviously the likes of Google and Apple, everyone's going to want to work for them and beat themselves. And you read the stories
for a period of time.
Yeah, you read the stories about these companies who are driving people to nervous breakdowns because they're making them work 80 hours a week. And just look at the NHS and junior doctors, and of course people are going to vote with their feet. So it's almost helping organizations realize that they don't have the power anymore, and they have to share it. They have to individualize work. They have to ask people what they want and deliver it and get out of their ivory towers.
Exactly.
Talk to people and listen. Because, all of this blanket, we're going to get everybody back to the office, or we're going to make everybody work from home. It's like, why does it have to be a blanket approach? Why can't you just, whatever works for you? Open plan offices, for me, as an ADHDer, are literally the least likely place I'm going to get anything done.
Yeah. Besides networking.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, hard relate.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of networking. I just find it awkward and cringe. But yes, it's put me in a quiet room on my own, leave me alone for a couple of hours, and I'll create some genius. But if you want me to work in a noisy, overly bright, distractible office with exciting people in, not a chance.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring Rebecca in because, hi, Rebecca, I know your tech gremlins are giving you some grief today. So
I apologise. I'm smiling in the background. So.
No problem. So I really see what you did with Love to Work, with your podcasting, with your book, and then also with the work that you started to do with organizations. Also, in this vein of kind of empowering and the sharing of power back to people who were working. I really see some reflections in that. How would you kind of describe your evolution in your practice and those kinds of things too?
So I think you're right on with that. That was exactly what drove me to align my practice in that way, because I felt very much like Michelle was describing, that basically work has just become this thing where it's like a control center. It's like everyone's supposed to do it in a certain way. And it's like, well, why? We're all humans. Everybody talks about, we hate work. Well, why does it have to be that way? Why do we have to hate work? We don't need to hate work. We've got to be there for probably, I think it's something like the stats, like a third of your life you spend at work. Well, let's make it better than shit. Like, why does it need to be crap? So definitely that's what drove it. And actually, while my personal needs have changed in that, one of the things I found most challenging with private practice was the amount of time I spent trying to build client relationships and get that work, which meant that, to support my young family, I was struggling a bit with that. So that's why I went down the road that I'm in. But what it's done is it's changed the way that I approach work now and the way in which I do my current role and the direction that I want to take my future career. Because now, in the past, I used to kind of go along with this idea that, we're all supposed to do work in a certain way. And now I'm pretty much known as, if not definitely one of the people that causes a bit of a raucous at work. Like, if something isn't right, then I will say, no, I don't think we should do it like that. I think we need to look at it in this way and think of it differently. And, I'll push people's buttons a little bit. And sometimes, people are on board with that. And other times they're like, we're not interested in what you've got to say. But I am not prepared to sit quietly anymore. And the other thing that it's kind of driven in me is, a lot of my work was kind of consulting based, in that I would go from client to client, do a few months here, and then you'd move on to the next thing, and it's very sort of transient, which is just the nature of consulting work. And it's made me realize that that's not really where I want to make my mark now. So the company that I work for, what I want to do is get more involved in how that company works, because what the organization does is creates, it's not just training, it's people development, people support for organizations. And I think it does a fantastic job of doing that. But I think we could do it better. I think we could do even more. I think we could be more efficient in how we do that. So it's kind of my experience in private practice, that dichotomy of like working in the business and working on the business. It's kind of given me that lens of saying, actually, I want to work on the business, but I understand the in the business piece of, delivering those things. And now I want to kind of continue to to build that out in a way that makes it work better. So it's been a really inspiring journey for me. It's given me, inspiration in ways that I don't think I would ever have gained had I not had that private practice experience. And I feel sure that I will go back to that later. But it's been a really interesting journey.
Yeah, and I'm really getting shades of how a private practice experience alters the psychological contract with organizations. When we've had to be responsible for our own business, I always say I would never make a really good employee now, because I can really feel what you're saying, both Michelle and Rebecca, that just staying quiet when things are not the way that you think that they should be. We get a bit used to, as you said, Michelle, having the power back in our hands. So as employees, if you were going to go back into a role like that, as you said, Rebecca, now it's like, actually, I'm a positive disruptor on this. I'm not just going to, I'm not just going to bring a lens of, what's the best way that I can play the game. I don't know how better to describe it other than, stay in the box, play the game as best as possible. Now, actually,
be a good employee.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
for what? The thing that really I've started to see, and I remember seeing it. I remember being, like a kid, and my mum saying to me, I've kind of lost out on my pension, or something changed with her pension, because she was she worked for local government for her whole career, and so she had these pensions, and then they kind of cut some of the pension at one point, and she'd invested her whole life in this, 35 years of just working. And I thought, well, if they can do that to you, why are we being so loyal to these organizations that can just pull the rug out from under us whenever they like? Why can't we be true to ourselves? Don't be a horrible person, but if you believe in something, drive yourself forward for it. There are always other organizations, there's always other jobs, other ways of making your income. I just think, let's not lose our sense of self and our souls in the work that we're doing. Let's just be ourselves and be true to ourselves as best we can while we make an income.
Yeah. And what I really hear with both of you, again, is about this shifting of the power relationship that is necessary if we're going to actually have a truly collaborative partnership. Because collaboration doesn't really happen with a steep power gradient, That's not what that is then. We need a flatter power gradient if there's actually going to be collaboration, if you're going to harness all of the potential of the people that are working on the same mission as you, in theory, right? So, Michelle, I'm going to come over to you actually and just ask you for a little bit of insight, whatever you can share with us about the book project, because I think it speaks to this a little bit.
Yes. So it was almost one of those things that come to you in the middle of the afternoon and just thinking, yes, this is exactly what I need to do now. And I've spent the last 2 years doing it. So the book is called Good Girl Deprogramming. It is a look at how society keep women and girls behaving through the use of coercive control.
Interesting.
So, a chap in the 1950s called Albert Biderman was a social scientist working for the US military, and he was tasked to figure out what magical brainwashing machine the Chinese had that were brainwashing prisoners of war from the Korean War to defect the American prisoners of war to defect to China. So the US military were losing their SHIT because they thought that all of their GIs would become Chinese citizens. And Albert Biderman came up with a chart of coercion, so 12 techniques that would be used to get people to do what you want. So I'm looking at that through a lens of our good girl programming, our conditioning to, it has unleashed so much. I've had to go through my own journey of unpicking all of that as well. And yes, it hopefully is coming out this year.
And so understanding those lenses or exploring those lenses of how different frameworks, it sounds as though it's kind of different frameworks, maybe, methods or cultural paradigms that are kind of shaping the way that people behave. Were any of those things that you suddenly thought, oh, I've seen that in organizations and I've seen that in organizations and so on? So this was...
Yeah, I've got so it's exactly the same underpinning, and I'm going to get James involved in the next book, but the next book is going to be called Uncorporatify. So it's a look at how...
I hope you got the URL on that before you transmit it live.
We've got the URL, it's trademarked, you know us, Wendy.
Yes.
We've got trademarks for all
hang
sorts.
on. Hit pause.
But it's how we are trained at school to be good students, and how those good student habits find us in a pickle in the workplace. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I remember... Oh God, I don't even know where I picked this up. Reading somewhere that, our education system, I'm really interested in my, educational psychologist colleagues' perspectives on this, but my education is probably not the same as what is happening in schools now, because obviously it was 40 years ago. But at the time, we were all learning to sit still, to stay in place for a certain amount of time, to follow centralized instructions, so there were all sorts of things.
To be disciplined, to do our homework, to do what we're told, not talk
exactly
back.
That. Exactly
it's the
that.
Same now, Wendy.
Right. Okay.
my
and I mean, I say that, but exactly, I've got 2 now young adult children, so I remember from primary and secondary school as well. But the thing that really struck me when I first heard about, why was that framework or approach applied versus how it prepared people for work, because in those days, and I remember these days, I had family who were working in mills, still cotton mills in the north of England, who were still clocking in. I had a job when I was at university during summer of clocking in. If you were 3 minutes late, you got docked an hour's pay, all this kind of, all these controlling lenses, essentially. But it was the kind of work that we were doing. But that's not what we're up to now, right? That's not what we can approach work with now.
And kids are leaving school without any critical thinking, abilities with looking, wanting to be right and wanting to be perfect and wanting to know the right answer and being able to adapt to authority. So completely not being themselves.
It's the inverse, actually, of what we probably need. Rebecca, I'm bringing you in here because I'm mindful that I can't pick up on visual signals. So I just wanted to kind of open the mic for your reflections on, some of these paradigms of control, because I can imagine for someone who is really concerned about people enjoying work and being supported to be able to be their best, that, that would be the antithesis from your perspective as well.
Yeah, it really is. I've been nodding along the whole time. It's such a difficult realm to explore, because I know when I was working in private practice for myself, I felt like I could really have a real big voice. And while I've now made the decision that I'm still going to have a voice, it's muted because of control. And that's not from anyone in particular. And it's not that I've been told to mute myself in any way, but it's this underlying sense of there's other people who control your destiny. And I don't think that's the way that we should be. I think we should have that space to be able to be ourselves and to in a way of, like you were saying, Wendy, this positive disruption, in this way that actually, if we allow people to speak out and we give them the floor and we give them that space, that they can actually do positive things and make change happen. It might be that some of the things that people come out with or whatever, that they're not super useful, but let's give them that space. And certainly that's a lot of the work that I do now. It's creating like programs that allow people to have that space, and training people in, managers in the workplace, leaders in the workplace, to give people their voice, and to be open to it, not to just give them it and then say, okay, well, we've let everybody talk now. Let's just put all this in the background somewhere and just store it away and do nothing with it, but to actually act on it, and how to act on it, and how to deal with the tensions and the stresses that come along with that. Because the world is changing consistently around us all the time. Everything's moving, everything's always changing. And none of us have the answers. We don't know how to deal with the weird things that are getting thrown at us. I mean, look at COVID. Look at, the political landscape that we're living in right now. It's completely uncharted territory. So how can we expect, just because someone's a leader in an organization, that they suddenly have all these answers? Yes, they have different experiences, but why don't the people in the organizations who are working on the ground have some ideas and thoughts too? And let's give them the floor and give them that space. And that's just what how I always think now. Anyone who comes to me and says, I have an idea, I say, get out there and bloody say it then. Get yourself in a space and tell someone about it. And they might turn around and say, I'm not interested, but at least you gave it a shot. As the Geordie phrase goes, shy Ben's getting out. And that is my ethos on life. You don't ask, you don't get. So get yourself out there,
That's your next book, Rebecca. Shy Ben's getting out.
It should be, shouldn't it?
Shy Ben's rather getting out.
That's for sure.
Really, a lot of things come up for me here. Obviously, talking about, I love this phrase of having a real big voice. I'm imagining real big voice with, capitalized. Because have you got one? Have you got that as a book? Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Playing big. Yes,
exactly. And I know we kind of all love that book too. It was Tara Moore's Playing Big book for the people who listen back on audio. But so two things really come to mind about that. One is how often we struggle as psychologists in private practice to have a real big voice. And when I talk about real, I mean like authentic, like our discussion today. We've had the tech grems, we've had, but this is courage to get out there and to say the things and to have the discussions and to be real about it without having, as you said, Michelle, these kind of lenses of control, which we then internalize, which, drive things like perfectionism and people pleasing. Exactly. So as psychologists, there's so much of that we get socialized into in different ways. I think, from what I've heard from my clinical colleagues, there's a lot about the actual clinical doctorate program that socializes people into, being a little bit afraid of breaking out of the box. And that might start off with good intentions, but I think it has developed and, gone further than that, and in ways that aren't necessarily useful. And The other thing that really strikes me is, I mean, Rebecca, you talked there about the amount of change that we're facing, the amount of change that's happening, whether it's pandemics, whether it's political change, but also, you know, look at what the IPCC report said earlier this year, which is BAU, business as usual, simply cannot continue. It can't continue. So it's either going to be, you know, looking at these big companies that are around, the business model is not viable within planetary boundaries. And therefore, if we don't change those things, you know, life is going to come quickly down the road to us, and then it will be unviable in other ways. So we're either going to change it proactively, or we're going to have to face a certain reality that certain industries are, you know, unable to continue. So in that sense, changing and shifting power relationships in organizations has to happen. Supporting people to deal with those changes in a way that enables them to continue and not just shut down in horror is important. And, you know, go into defensiveness and descend into conflict and so on. And I think there's a lot of necessity to continue to bolster one another, to provide hope for one another, to keep looking forward, and to keep dismantling things that are getting in the way as we hopefully at least move towards some things that continue to, you know, be viable in terms of a future. And, you know, part of me, when I looked at, so in 2020, I had a big change in my direction as well, thinking about the evolutions of business, which was, I was doing a lot of corporate work up until 2020, developed systems for getting return on investment from overseas job moves. We'd been capturing data about ROI. I had the okay from the global head of talent. We were going to roll it out across a global organization. And then the pandemic hit and all the borders got shut. No one got moved. And at the same time, everyone in psychology, everyone went online, and this business suddenly started to really move. But the thing that really kind of struck me at that time was that I was really disheartened, not by the clients particularly that I was working with, to be honest, but other organizations that I saw that I was kind of adjacent to, where I saw some of the behavior that was happening in response to this big disruption that been talking about for 20 years was on its way. It's why we were developing agile leadership. It's why we were, you know, talking about how do we deal with the VUCA world and all these things. And as soon as the VUCA world became really real, everyone reverted back to type and like forgot everything.
Yeah.
And so Rebecca, you saw that too.
Yes, absolutely. I did. It's nuts. I often think we talk, and when I say we, I mean society talks a good game about many things.
Yeah.
But in reality, it doesn't play out that way. One of the things I think is such a sort of weird oxymoron is that, you know, we look up to our hierarchical elders in organizations as the people who know best. And then suddenly there comes a point where those elders are too old and they all get pushed out and nobody wants to hire them. And you're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, surely these are the wise people that we've been looking to for all this time. And then all of a sudden we're not interested anymore because, you know, you're over 60 or whatever it is.
50
now. And you just think, where's the sense in this? Like, what are we doing? We're not thinking about the value that people can add and the individuals that you know that we need to help us move society forward in a positive way. It's crazy. The messages are very different to the realities in many ways.
So I really admire both of you for kind of being, to use an ancient industrial metaphor, at the coalface. In kind of provoking and pushing and cajoling and supporting and all of these other things, these big Leviathan companies and their legacy systems and legacy paradigms to actually shift direction. So I'm going to come across to you, Michelle. What do you hope for the future when it comes to working with big companies to create positive change in the workplace? What are you hoping for?
You know what, honestly, we've limited our work with big companies.
Interesting.
Because they are too hard to stop and change. So we are concentrating our efforts on the smaller organizations where we can actually make a difference, because we find that, well, individual coaching is fine. We can do that in big companies and it's just a one-to-one really. But if we want to actually make systemic change, I know this is against what the podcast is called, but, you know, me being contrarian, it's like not as usual. If you want to make big change, you work in a smaller pool. And if you look at the number of people you can affect in smaller organizations, I can't remember the figures, but most companies in the UK, and especially, you know, well, across the developed world, have fewer than 50 people.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, and it is all about, and they're sort of human-sized companies where there are relationships and you're not turned into a cog in the machine. So I think if I could give some advice to those in bigger companies, is look at the smaller companies, look at what they're doing that make work more tolerable, bearable, fun, you know, moving towards Rebecca's loving the work, because they are able to personalize their approach. They're able to individualize their workstation or work location, or, you know, look at what their strengths are and harness those strengths and work cross purpose. Because one of the things in big companies that used to drive me insane was that we're all in silos. You know, IT didn't talk to finance, didn't talk to HR, didn't talk to the guys constructing buildings, and it was just so fragmented. And in a smaller company, we can have those more organic cross-pollination type collaborations.
Yes, I wonder how, because I think there is a route for change at the level of small and medium-sized companies then to start filtering and influencing the way that bigger companies work. And I'm kind of fascinated to see how that evolves. Rebecca, I'm coming to you because I know that you're also involved with larger companies. For your perspective on how you see we can kind of, or what are, you know, the hopes for the future in terms of influencing and changing some of those bigger companies?
I sit on both sides. So in some ways, Michelle, I agree with you. I think a lot of the smaller companies can really kind of shape the path for how we should do things, because it's a lot easier for them to shift their ways of working more quickly. Just, you know, financially, it can be easier. But I've always had this drive to get into these big organizations. I remember when I first started my career, my plan was to work in some of the big banks, because I just felt like they were so archaic in their thinking that that's where I wanted to be and that's what I wanted to shift. And I still think in that way. I think if we can really get in and plant a seed, even in a small department of a large organization, if you get that right and you start to kind of change minds and shift thinking in those small ways, then you can kind of pollinate that across the organization. But the ways in which you pollinate that, that's what takes the thinking. Those kind of relationships that you build and those learnings that kind of spread across are difficult to generate. And it's not an easy process, but I think that's where we can start to really change minds. And that's what I kind of continue to drive home, I think.
Yeah. And so again, it comes back to this shifting power relationship whereby influencing and shifting and creating that more positive change within pockets, within a workforce, which can then spread. I mean, I never remember the name, but there was a Nobel Prize winning scientist, who I think won the prize for chemistry, who talked about how when systems are at their highest level of chaos, you can create small islands of coherence, you can actually start to shift the overall system into a greater level of coherence. So in all different kind of paradigms we see there, actually shifting power relationships and creating positive disruptions. And I think, Michelle, your point about bringing awareness to the mechanisms of control so that we can see them and we can hopefully move beyond them is how we not just shift small and medium organizations, whether it's private practices or, bigger companies, but we also start to hopefully shift larger organizations as well. Awesome. Where can we find both of you on social media? Michelle?
LinkedIn.
Yeah, get that in the show notes. Yes. Yes, exactly. Rebecca, how about you?
Same for me, actually. I used to be on lots of different social media channels, and I found I was whittling away my time and life trying to keep them up. And so, LinkedIn is where you can find me. But I'm really good at responding to people as well. I love a chat. I love, to connect with people. So if you want to reach out, I'm
fantastic.
all for it.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much for being here today. And also thank you to everyone who joined in and had a listen or a watch on LinkedIn or on Facebook. And thanks to Michelle Minnikin from Work Pirates and Rebecca Longman. And we will look forward to seeing you next week, where we are talking about the power of neurodiversity practices. So I will look forward to seeing you all again then. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. I'd love to hear what you think about the Inspiring Psychologists podcast. So please take a moment to leave a review and give us a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a massive difference in helping us to reach new audiences. If, like me, you're feeling inspired and moved by the private practice stories in our podcasts, please spread the word across your own networks. And why not encourage your colleagues and friends to listen to the podcast too? To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes, please be sure to subscribe to the Inspiring Psychologists podcast. You can find out more about all my guests from Series 1 at our website, inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com.